After hundreds of thousands of years of living in relative peace, the various humans of the solar system learned some very troubling news. For a long time, the Jupiterians had been keeping an eye on a nearby star called Betelgeuse, which was about 1,000 times larger than the Sun. They kept watch on it because it was a few hundred years overdue of going supernova. Then one day, during a routine check, they realized that it finally did, and that it would be much worse than anyone could have predicted. Two powerful gamma rays had formed on either side of the star, gamma rays powerful enough to destroy anything in their path. Gamma rays that were headed straight for the solar system. Due to how far away Betelgeuse was, the solar system had about 650 years to figure something out before they were wiped out of existence. And so the leaders of the various planets met in the Starscapes, a Jupiterian space station kept in the asteroid belt, used specifically for meetings like this. The leaders included Prime Minister Fran Terrace of Earth, Chairman Leighton Attrick of Mars, and co-presidents Jabubu and Pietra Okovan of the Jupiterian Republic, along with their various advisors, of course. As you can imagine, they weren't exactly seeing eye to eye to start with, since each of them valued the people of their own planet above the others. PM Terrace explained that Earth was historically important, being the birthplace of not only humanity, but intelligence itself, as far as anyone could tell. It was the only place in the known universe to foster intelligent life, and as such, it should be prioritized. In response, Chairman Attrick said that Earth was a deserted, war-torn wasteland, and it was getting what it deserved. That is a direct quote. It did not go over well. The leaders discussed the problem for over 12 hours, but no compromise was met, and they ultimately left to solve the problem on their own. Lacking the appropriate skill or capital, Earth's government couldn't really put much together, ultimately making a fleet of generation ships that could house maybe 30% of the Earth's population. Mars had similar results after being distracted with anti-Jupiterian movements, since, after all, the Jupiterians were the ones that gave them the bad news to start with. But in the end, they fared a little bit better than the Earthlings, and made a fleet that could carry around 80% of their population. The Jupiterians, however, already having a flourishing scientific community, created a single rotating generation ship called the Ark, which could house 114% of the Moon's population, or about 2 billion people. Of course, that's only if the Ark was packed to maximum capacity, which would be very uncomfortable. So they also repurposed several of their other space stations, like the Starscape, for example, so that they too could be used as generation ships, and allow for a more comfortable journey. In the end, they had enough room for over 200% of their population. When news of the Jupiterians' excess of empty seats reached the other planets, Earthlings and Martians collected all the money they had to pay for a flight to Jupiter. Now, that's not to say the Jupiterian government was charging for a seat aboard the Ark. They weren't. If a Terraman found their way to the moons, they could get aboard the Ark for free. However, they would still have to pay Earth for a flight to the moon in the first place, which could be very expensive. It was a price many Earthlings and Martians were willing to pay, however, since tens of thousands of them made their flight to the moons and boarded the Ark. 400 years after Betelgeuse first went supernova, as the gamma rays grew closer and the arcs began to fill, the fleet of Jupiterian generation ships had to take off, and regrettably, leave some of the latecomers behind. This event became known as the Great Migration, and was seen as such a monumental moment that it became a new year zero for humanity. The Ark itself was made up of 3 city-sized rings spinning around a single point fast enough to mimic gravity. Because of this, it was prone to cause motion sickness in many people. While this was a problem that would only take a few years to fully acclimate to, most of the Ark citizens didn't want to suffer through it and started taking medication that would lessen the effects of motion sickness. However, Jupiterian laws put limitations on how effective these medications could be, and unfortunately the legal limit was still far too low to satiate most of the populace's constant nausea. And so many people turned to fill the lucrative market of illegal drug trafficking. Droves of street gangs filled the Ark's underbelly, selling beefed-up nausea medicine and tranquilizers. An especially cutthroat group was known as the Blue Rockets. This group was led by an old Terraman named Blank Jacket, who gained the equivalent of $180 million worth of Jupiterian credits, before being killed and replaced by Ben Omen, his son-in-law. As you can probably tell from Ben Omen and his wife being stuck together on a ship, the various human subspecies began to marry and interbreed with each other. Obviously, at this point, they were too genetically dissimilar to produce fertile children. But that wasn't really an issue because with the use of advanced Jupiterian technology, the Chimera generations were able to make themselves fertile and have children of their own. Within a few generations, the vast majority of the Ark citizens were hybrid crosses of the various species, with the only major exceptions being the highest of the upper class, which tried to remain as purebred as possible, and small groups of purebred Martian communities scattered throughout the Ark. As for the Ark's destination, it was a planet called Maya Proxima 12b, now simply called Maya. It was a small exoplanet orbiting a red dwarf in the Andromeda Galaxy. The Jupiterians chose this planet in particular because it was inhabited by the descendants of one of the first human generation ships. It also happened to be one of the few groups that kept in regular contact with Earth. sending basic messages every 20 or so years to let them know that things were still going well. After 217 years of travel, or 9 total generations who were born and raised on the Ark, they eventually reached their destination. Their entrance into the Mayan atmosphere was quite dramatic, with the Ark getting a little too close to the planet's gravity well and being pulled violently into the ocean below in a cloud of fire and smoke. The crash killed thousands, but the majority of the citizens were able to board secondary crafts and escape before the Ark plummeted into the warm, shallow waters of the Mayan Sea. As the weary refugees waded through the knee-high ocean, the residents of the world gathered at the shores of the mainland, greatly confused as to what they had just witnessed. At long last, it was time for the people of the solar system to meet the long-lost cousins of humanity.